Okay, well, we are back, and we're continuing our whirlwind tour of Rails. We kind of structured our tour around the idea that what most Rails applications do really is they manipulate models. Models is where the action is, and that there's these four basic operations of create, read, update, and delete that you can do on them. And we're now going to deal with forms, which are going to take us to the create and update actions. Really, we just dealt with read before. So you've all dealt with forms. They allow you to fill in little stuff on a website, submit it to a server. And for our purposes, the interesting thing that we're going to realize is that creating a form usually takes two interactions, because the first thing you have to do is you have to do some action that causes the form to be served to the user. Then the user fills in some stuff, and then the user submits it. So you really need two actions. You need one that knows how to generate the form and one that knows how to accept the form submission. So we're going to treat those as separate cases. So we have to figure out, how do we generate the form? That's an action. When the user fills in their values, how do we get access to the information they filled in? And when we're all done with that, what do we return or what do we render? Remember, we're dealing with HTTP, which is a request-reply protocol. That means every request, something has to come back and be rendered. So what is the right answer to do that for these different kinds of form interactions? So continuing our sort of cookbook things that we know how to do with Rails, here's how you create a new submittable form. And we're going to walk through each step of this process. First, we have to identify the action that serves the actual form, the blank form that the user is going to fill in. Or we'll see it could be a form that already has some information pre-populated. For example, if you're making a change to an existing resource, the form might show up already populated with the old info, and then you can type in new info. Then you have to identify which action is going to receive the submitted form, and that's where we're going to get access to whatever the user entered. We have to make sure that we have routes, controller actions, and views for each of these two things. And as we'll see, when we create the form, the name attributes on all the form elements is how we're going to get our hands on the data that the user typed. They're going to appear as keys in this magical hash-looking thing called params that we saw briefly before, and we're going to see a couple of times more during this segment and the next couple of segments. And as we'll see, as with so many things in Rails, the common case is provided for by a number of different helpers that you can call so that you don't have to manually deal with all the form construction. In fact, it's fair to say that the Rails view of a form is that it's really a thing that ultimately gets backed by a model. So what you'll see is a lot of the helpers for creating and dealing with forms are really based on the idea that a form is exactly a view of a model, but it's an updatable view because the user can type stuff. So let's talk first about how we create the form. We need an action that is going to serve the form to the user so that they can fill it in. And to do that, we're going to take a look at a very simplified version of a form in HTML. And if this works. So a couple of things to notice about a simple HTML form. Here's a simplified version of the form for creating a new movie. And a couple of things to notice. First of all, the actual form tag that encloses everything has to have at least an action and a method. This is really what's going to determine where the form is submitted. And remember, we've kept saying that a route consists of both an HTTP method and a URI, and indeed you see them both here. The HTTP method is going to be post, and here is the path portion of the URI. And then inside the form, we have a number of elements. Input elements and select elements are examples of things where the user can specify values. And you'll note that all of those have a name attribute. And the name attribute is going to be the key of how we get that information in the controller method. Now, it might look a little bit weird if you're coming from other web environments that the names of these attributes have brackets, like movie bracket title, movie bracket rating. And in a moment, we're going to see why that turns out to be a useful naming convention. The names can more or less be anything you want, but there's a good reason to make them look like this. So we're going to generate the named form. Only the inputs that have name attributes are going to be submitted. And we can often use a URI helper for the action part of that form. Remember, we said the whole point of the Rails routing subsystem is to avoid having to hardwire URIs all over the place. In fact, it gives you these helper methods that generate the URIs associated with various RESTful actions, including the CRUD actions. And we actually already saw an example of that. We're going to take a look now at the Rails code for creating that simple form. Right? So here's the form as it's going to appear when it arrives at the browser. But looking briefly at what this looks like in Haml, and what I did here is I included underneath each line of Haml, I included one or more lines of the HTML that would be generated from that Haml so you can see what the mapping is. So this line with the action and the method that we saw in the HTML form actually came from this Haml tag. Right? This is just a Ruby method called form tag, and it takes one argument, which is the URI of the receiving action for this form. And we're using one of the URI helpers so that we don't have to hard code a URI in here. That's why I said form tag movies path. I could have just as well said form tag quote/movies, as long as I have a way of specifying the path portion of the URI that's going to receive that form. The form tag has got a body. You pass it a block with do. And inside of the body, you can see, for example, that some of the fields in the form, here's an example of the text field where the user would type in a name for a new movie. What it comes from in Haml is this text field helper method, right? What's going on here is that you're telling text field there's a such thing as a model called movie. One of its attributes is a title. And what I want you to do is generate a form element suitable for editing that attribute. So again, it's really much the view is not you're designing a form. The view is you're designing something that is an editable version of the information already associated with a model. Right? So that's why the form tag helpers like text field, you don't have to use these. Right? You could code the raw HTML in Haml if you wanted. But the benefit of doing that is it reveals intent, and it allows you to connect the form very obviously to which attributes of the model it's supposed to be editing.